I've been a hunter for almost a decade already. Not the kind of hunter you think about, though. I don't wear the orange vest, don't exactly use the usual equipment either. If I tell you what I hunt, you're gonna sneer and look the other way, lips mouthing of how big of a charlatan I am. After all, you've never seen what I hunt. A majority of you haven't and never will. Even if I tell you, you'll continue to blissfully living your life, ignorant that the dimension we live on even hosts some of these beings. You'll wake in the morning, take a piss, eat your cereal, knowing your routine is safe and sound. Fantasy doesn't exist here, except in books, movies, and games. And you aren't some kind of tragic protagonist. Monsters aren't real until you meet one, huh? Well, don't worry. Everybody's the same. However, in the event that you do cross a path with one, you better hope there's a guy like me around. We're not that easy to find, but our special brand of service can be requested by submitting a form on our website. If you know where to look, you'll find us. Now, the mayor of Mud Lake, Idaho, found us. Why, you ask? Because a streak of unnatural disappearances made him desperate for help of any kind. After trying with the nearest town's police force and the government, they had no choice but to rely on a rogue agency. I had to travel all the way from Montana for this job, but it's one of these jobs I'll remember all my life. I was called by the agency one morning. The meeting point was set outside of my town, and I was to be there in 2 days. When I arrived at the meeting point, I was briefed about the job. A town of about 400 people was under attack, and the government couldn't help. It's always about the small towns. Monsters know where to target to avoid trouble. Plus, 400 people meant a lot of food for a long time, unless the town knew where to ask for help. In fact, how many towns have been completely wiped in the pre-internet era? Monster hunter services are difficult to come by in the era of technology. I can't fathom how difficult it must have been back then. Of those 400, almost 30 had disappeared in the last 6 months. I suggested that the beast, no matter what it was, fed about once a week. I dealt with several monsters in the past, but most of them fed on moon cycles or trimesters. Another thing of note when it comes to monsters is the more they need to feed, the more ferocious they can be. As a rule of thumb, abominations that feed on the daily are the worst to deal with. They often have disguises to be able to hunt without fear. They take the face of the very thing they wish to devour and are absolutely merciless. Once they're done, nothing's left behind. The creatures who eat weekly aren't much different. They're gluttonous and unforgiving. And already I knew I was going to deal with an A-rank creature. I hadn't fought one in at least 3 years. For some reason, most ferocious beasts resided in the south. We up north in Montana usually deal with the foul moon beasts, which is why I was surprised to find that my neighbor state of Idaho, there was something as fierce and violent as an A-rank monster rampaging through a small town. The contract and details were simple enough. Find the creature and put an end to this town's misery. The biggest obstacle in my way was the fact that there had been no sightings of the creature at all. At most, people described it as a shadow with long clawed fingers and an intangible form. They called it a specter, a demon. The truth was even simpler. They had no idea what it was. Nobody who had seen it lived to tell the tale. So basically, I was to get my ass into gear and go wander into a town with a loose freak I had no clue how to fight. Not a big deal. I just planned to bring everything with me. I asked the agency if I could keep the reports so I could read them over in the motel rooms as I made my way to Mud Lake. They didn't reveal much that I didn't expect already. Crime scenes were splattered in blood, there wasn't so much as a fingernail left behind by the creature. The only reason the resident mayor was calling for our help in particular was because nobody could explain how shit like that happened. Government officials scouted the area. The helicopters flew over the fields, and nothing unusual had been found. I decided that this creature had a modus operandi. In other words, it was smart enough not to leave anything behind when it was done. My car was filled to the brim with monster hunting material, equipment. I still had no idea what I was going to fight, but I'm the type of person who prepares for everything. I don't like to be caught by surprise. I had a few silver bullets, some handguns, a crossbow that shot stakes, and a lot of special items, but something just didn't seem right. I felt like something was missing in my arsenal, so I reviewed everything twice. My dog barked in the distance, and I realized he was the one I was forgetting. Now, normally, I don't take him with me on hunts because, as I said earlier, our monsters here are easier to deal with. They're less ferocious. It served no purpose to bring my most loyal companion with me and put his life at risk. However, this time was different. Without him, I would be the one in danger. I opened the door of my house to let him out. My black lab looked as strong as he did 5 years ago, even if he was now blind in one eye. The bastard had almost literally taken a bullet for me when I last fought a ferocious blood-drinking abomination. Its claws had pierced my dog's skull, and I could still hear the whine of my dog and feel the dread I felt. Fortunately, I was quick enough to save him. Unfortunately, he has to come with me this time. "What do you say we go on an adventure, you and I?" He barked at me, tail wagging. I wondered if he knew what we were doing. He looked so blissfully happy to join me, but he probably knew. I couldn't guarantee his safety, just as I couldn't guarantee my own. I sat him on the passenger seat, buckled my belt, and drove off. We had several hours to drive before we could stop at a motel to rest. I planned to be in Mud Lake by noon the next day, so I had no time to waste. When I reached Mud Lake, the first thing I did was drive to City Hall and ask to meet the mayor. I was told there that the mayor hadn't been seen in 2 days, which would coincide with the day he called the agency. If anything happened to him, I was most likely 48 hours too late for that. When I asked for his address, I was rebuked and told that this kind of information was confidential. I could always call the agency back and ask for help, but I decided to walk around town instead, see if any of the folks look suspicious. I'd seen enough monsters in my lifetime to know one when I saw one. Now, unfortunately, because of the fear that crippled this town's residents, not a lot of them were out and about. I went to the local market, bought some food for my dog, and looked over the cashiers and guests cautiously. None of them were suspicious, but all of them had the same look in their eyes. They weren't used to visitors in this town. It's not like I was unwelcomed, but considering the events that were taking place, I also wasn't seen under a good light. I left the market and sat on a bench, turning my head up to the sky as my dog ate and drank his fill. I had a large coffee and a bagel in the morning, so I didn't feel too hungry. Probably have something heavy at dinner instead. And I decided to keep exploring town, but honestly, I was done in less than an hour. See, the streets were empty. I felt like I was wasting my time, and so I decided to go a little further on the outskirts. I watched the cornfield, and I remember thinking how dense those fields were. I wonder if a helicopter would really be able to see a thing through the rows, if it was hiding. All of a sudden, my dog started barking, so I parked the car on one side of the road. From the sound of it, he was getting pretty agitated too. It was midday, the sun was burning, the skies were clear, but I too felt a little agitated. I grabbed my handgun, secured a crossbow on my back, and planted various accessories on my body to defend myself. I didn't particularly expect for the beast to show up in plain sight during the day, but if that happened, that only meant this creature couldn't be underestimated. Most use the fresh and dark nights to conceal themselves. If it was too bold as to attack during the day, then it would be a formidable enemy. As soon as I opened the passenger door, my dog came out barking and dashed into the cornfield. Well, I expected it too, and so I locked the door and followed in tow, boots biting into the soil as I ran after my dog. My heart was hammering in my chest, and the heat of the sun was adding weight on my shoulders. In retrospect, I regret not bringing a bottle of water with me. Hell, I could have died of dehydration out there. The deeper we got into the corn rows, the louder my dog was getting. I screamed his name to bark back to me, and I heard him growl and bark. I was getting closer, which meant my pet stopped moving. When I arrived where he stood, my dog's tail was curled between his legs and he was sniffling and growling. He wasn't wounded or anything, but the stench of decay reached my nose before my eyes saw the scene. A couple of meters ahead of me, there were a bunch of dead birds. And I mean, a dead bird or two is a thing. But 20 headless crows with their belly ripped wide open in the same spot was not a common sight. I shushed my dog so that he'd stay quiet, and I concentrated hard. I wanted to make sure we were all alone in this field. I couldn't hear a single noise. I looked back at the bird pile and knelt down near one. I wasn't going to touch it with my hand. I could see well enough with my eyes that they'd been dead for a day or two, and that their wounds didn't suggest they were considered food. The creature probably killed them because they were making noise where he wanted none. Swallowing thickly, I stood up and started walking further ahead. My dog walked by my side and I could tell he was nervous. He kept looking left and right, making small growls here and there. I had to shush him every time. If that creature killed what made too much noise, then the last thing we wanted was to call it to us. But I could feel that I was getting closer. The smell of blood filled my nose, and I knew it wasn't because of the rotting birds behind us. To my displeasure, we soon found the source of that stench. I felt my stomach twist in a knot when I first found it, though. A pastel blue shoe that mustn't been longer than 5 or 6 inches. Its owner was no doubt very little, and if the dark stain on the shoe was telltale of anything, I was soon going to stumble upon a very disturbing scene. It just reminded me of how wrong I had been in my assumption. I thought the monster was a clean eater that was smart enough to leave no trace before him. Unfortunately, I was going to face a ferocious, messy eater who had just found the best place to hide the carcass of his victims. A few steps further, I found what looked like the remnant of a small child's leg. A portion of the knee was still intact, and rotting tendons were still stuck in a gnarly mass of flesh, bones, fat tissue, and decaying skin. Hell, I might not be a coroner, but I'd seen enough dead bodies in my lifetime to know that poor child must have died a couple of weeks ago. So this probably meant that the child wasn't the last meal. And if it was, it meant that the beast was currently hungry. I heard the rustle of leaves on my right, and my hand instinctively went to my holster, fingers skirting across the cold metal of my gun. I could feel sweat dripping down the side of my face, heat pressing down even harder on my shoulders. It felt like I was breathing near a fire with how hot the sun was getting, and suddenly, I was too painfully aware of the dryness in my throat. My dog was panting harshly next to me as we kept moving, and we found the rest of what was a dead girl. Only a fragment of her ribcage was left behind, gnawed completely clean of all skin and fat tissue. Flies flew about her discarded head, wild brown curls knotted with blood and soil. She couldn't have been older than 6, but I had no time to give her a proper burial. I was on the beast's killing grounds, and I could feel its presence all around me. I wouldn't be surprised if the 30 bodies were scattered around in this field. For what little was left, it made sense that nobody saw shit from a helicopter, and I started walking faster. My instincts were telling me I was close to the truth. As I breached past the corn line and my foot hit grass, a scream tore through the atmosphere. Ahead of me was a farmhouse, and so I ran toward it with all I had, despite my thirst and fear. My dog picked up on what was happening and started running too, but was smart enough not to bark. When we reached the source of the scream, we both stopped in our tracks, and I reached for my crossbow. Silver wouldn't be enough. I needed a stake covered in holy water to take down the beast. It wasn't that the creature was big nor strong, but it was certainly angry. The passed out gal on the ground in front of us had already had her arm gnawed right off, and claws were buried deep into her abdomen. The creature was wiggling its claws and making a mess of her organs, as if prepping his food before eating it. Just as the report said, it looked intangible, but it wasn't. There was a body under all that distorted reality. Looking at it gave the feeling of looking at a TV on a channel that didn't exist. There was noise on the screen, but there was something inside. I aimed my crossbow at it, pulled back the string. The beast stopped moving, turned its faceless body towards us, and started sniffing the air. I was sweating too much for it to not sniff me. I took aim and shot, the stake piercing right through the creature's heart. It howled as it stumbled toward me, body melting like the wax of a candle under the burning sun. As it reached my ankle, it was nothing more than a puddle of evil dissipating into thin air. And that gal, she was done for. But I heard the creaking sound of a porch door and saw the face of a terrified man. Fortunately, I didn't have to explain what happened to the poor girl. Somewhere in this town there's a child who died of hunger recently. What you saw was his vengeful spirit coming back to kill what I assumed to be people who knew him. You find the connection and you'll find who let that child die. Now I stopped it for now, but it'll come back on the anniversary of his death if you don't find the culprit. I won't come back to help you again if you don't put in the effort, I told the man, who I learned later was the mayor. The girl on the ground was his daughter. In a town of 400 people, finding the connection mustn't have been that hard, because I didn't receive a call the following year. Either Mud Lake was wiped off the map, or they found the culprit. I never bothered to check. Some things are just better left unknown.